So welcome everyone. My name is András Tálas and I will hold this presentation together with my colleague Markus Dorman. The webinar is about the new GSMA IoT specification which has lately been published by GSMA. We will discuss about this specification and a little bit what it could mean for your business. The agenda for the webinar, there is a short introduction about ourselves and Comprion. Then what is the rationale for a third remote SIM provisioning specification? We will discuss this question. Then we will look at the architecture of the new IoT specification and explain a little bit. And finally, we will give our analysis and also what do we expect regarding the adoption. And we would like to have a little discussion around this topic. What I would like to mention that the slides and also a little abbreviation sheet is available in the handout of your GoToMeeting panel. And also we would like to encourage you, in case you have any question, please also type in your GoToWebinar panel in the questions. And at the end of the webinar, we will have time for discussing and answering the questions. Okay, so 2 words about myself. My name is András Tálas. I'm technical consultant in Comprion. I'm working in standardization, mainly in eSIM, NFC, SSP areas. I'm working at Comprion since 10 years. And Markus, it's your turn.
Yes, hello. Also good morning from my side. I'm Markus Dorman. I'm with Comprion since 1.5 years. I'm doing a mix of innovation, business development, and product management. And before joining Comprion, I worked for the GSMA, this industry association, which is also creating these specifications. And before this, I worked for a big operator. And also, from my side, same as András said, please put in questions into the GoToWebinar tool. Yesterday in the slot, we had a very lively discussion based on many questions, which was great. I would hope that we can replicate this for today. Good. So next slide, please, András. Thank you. Just that you know, not just who is talking to, but also with which company we are with. For those who don't know Comprion. So Comprion is a Germany-based company. We are specialized in test solutions and tools for contact and contact-less communication. Devices such as smart cards, eSIM, smartphones, and so forth. So eSIMs and before this, the SIM cards, but nowadays eSIMs is one of our core product areas where we serve the industry with a number of test solutions for all the elements which are part of an eSIM remote SIM provisioning architecture. We provide tools to manage eSIM profiles, and we provide also tools which allow companies to set up development environments for certain elements of the eSIM and remote SIM provisioning architecture. So that's our main business, but to keep this short, let's go immediately to the next slide. Thanks. So why this webinar? So this IoT remote SIM provisioning specification has been published just recently, as András explained. It's very new. It contains a number of exciting features from our perspective. And this is what we wanted to share with you because our assumption is that this can be relevant for many of you. We think we're quite well positioned to do this because we are part of this GSMA standardization working groups. So we have been part of the process since its beginning. And that's why we think we have a pretty good understanding of the technology, but also about the dynamics and the discussions around the specifications and the evolution of the specifications. If we continue, the questions we want to address is really, why do we need another specification? There are the consumer device specification and the M2M specification already available. So something needs to be missing maybe, and we will discuss this, and András will discuss this in a minute. Architecture, of course, but in particular, I would like then to point out where the architecture addresses the requirements of this new specification, which to some extent are the shortcomings of the previous specifications. Quite interesting will be a discussion how this new specification relates or does not relate to the existing consumer and M2M specification. And from this, you will also see how the adoption roadmap might happen and might evolve. And when we will see product in market, which I think is also of interest for you. We go to the next slide. Yeah, for whom is this relevant or interesting? It's interesting for everybody who is either delivering and developing products in the area of remote SIM provisioning and eSIM. So whether this is RSP backend services, the hardware, the devices, the modules, or even connectivity services. But it's also then the same relevant for companies who leverage and to utilize this technology for IoT use case in enterprise use cases from the various verticals. And one question which we have seen is relevant for most of you is the question, okay, it seems that it has some similarity from the addressed use case segment to the M2M spec. So when should I use the M2M spec? When should I use the IoT spec? Should I wait for the IoT spec or go ahead with the M2M spec? Do I need to switch from M2M to IoT later on? So these kind of question for this is also we want to provide the input for. That's it from my side. Back to Andras.
Yeah, and the first question is why there is a need for a third SIM remote provisioning specification. So how we see there are two main points. One is to address resource-limited IoT devices. Current specification, especially consumer specification, does not do this. So what resource-limited IoT devices means? It means network constraints devices which has no SMS or TCP/IP capability. And the other group which is currently addressed is user interface constraints devices with very small user interface or no user interface at all. So this is one point to address these kind of devices. And the other point is to get rid of business inflexibilities or lock-in situations, which are mainly in the M2M specification. The most relevant example is the SMSR lock-in. Although this is technically possible to change SMSR, but practically it's very difficult to move devices from one SMSR to the SMSR of another vendor. This supply of UICC and profile management and the connectivity typically comes from the same vendor. That's what we see in the M2M specification. That's why it's difficult to have a single SMSR controlling all devices and at the same time to have different or multiple vendors for the connectivity. So this is the main reasons why we think there is a need for a third remote SIM provisioning specification, but we would like to know also how do you see this question. So the fulfillment of which requirements is most important from your perspective for the IoT specification. So let me start now a poll. You will see on your monitor or mobile phone the question and 4 or 5 different answers. You can select multiple answers. Please take your time to read it, and we are waiting for your answers. So according to your answers, 48% of you who have voted say that the most important from your perspective is to address devices with limited user interface. 59% saying the most important is to address devices with network constraint. Then the highest value, 78%, is to solve business issues related to, for example, SMSR lock-in. And there is 31% who is saying other important requirements which are not mentioned here. And no one of you saying that there is no need for a new specification M2M is appropriate. So thank you for your answers. It's valuable. And then let's go back to the presentation and look at the architecture itself. I will start the architectures with the first architecture, the M2M architecture, and we will see the evolution and especially the changes between the three different architectures. So within the M2M architecture, we have the device with the UICC. We have the SMDP, Subscription Manager Data Preparation. So this is the remote entity responsible for profile preparation and download. We have the SMSR, Subscription Management Secure Routing. This is the entity responsible for UICC and profile management and the secure routing between the SMDP Plus and the SMSR. And we have the operator who is basically triggering the profile order, the profile management, and the UICC management operations. Within the M2M architecture, the subscription management is remote. Each device UICC is registered with one single SMSR. And the SMSR change is technically possible, but business-wise, it is not really feasible because it requires business and legal contract between competitors. So let's look at the consumer architecture, how it differs from the M2M architecture. M2M architecture is operator-centric, while the consumer architecture is consumer-centric. So there is no SMSR in the consumer architecture, but for the profile management, there is an entity called LPA, Local Profile Assistant. This is a mobile application residing on the device. And this Local Profile Assistant, it's basically a proxy between the SMDP Plus and the UICC, and it enables users, consumers, to by himself to enable, disable, delete, or download the profile. The LPA has its interfaces towards the SMDP Plus, this is an HTTPS interface, and towards the UICC, this is an APDU interface. There is a new entity which is called Subscription Manager Discovery Server, and this is to give a better user experience for profile downloading. It has its interfaces with the SMDP Plus and the LPA. This is the consumer architecture, and then let's take a look at the IoT architecture. We will see that the IoT architecture is very similar to the consumer architecture. Actually, it's built on consumer RSP specification version 2, but there are some differences. So there were three main features which need to be supported by the IoT architecture. One of these is the remote UI. So to enable devices with limited or no UI for profile provisioning, remote UI feature needs to be supported by the IoT architecture. How this is done? It's basically the LPA component is cut into twice. One part remains on the device. This is the IPA, UICC Profile Assistant, and it will play a proxy role between the UICC and the other component, which is called EIM, UICC IoT Remote Manager. So this is a remote component, and the UICC IoT Remote Manager through the ESIPA interface can send remote profile state management operations to the UICC. So this is possible to remotely enable, disable, delete profiles, and also to trigger profile download. This is one of the functions to be supported the remote UI. The other function is to support lightweight protocol. So in case the device itself does not support HTTPS, but it supports different protocols, for example, CoAP, this is the EIM, which makes the protocol conversion between the device and the SMDP Plus. And this way it supports devices with network constraint. And it is doing also towards the SNDS, this protocol conversion. And the third thing is the architecture needs to support a lightweight profile. So for those devices which has very small, in the UICC has very small memory, there is a need to define a profile with a very small footprint, a minimal profile. And this architecture supports this profile. So here I would like to also mention that out of the architecture, this is possible to provision also consumer profiles as long as the UICC supports it. So this is about the IoT architecture and how it addresses constrained devices. And there was another main point which we have highlighted as an important feature of the IoT specification. This is to address the SMSR lock-in situation. So within the IoT specification, the EUICC is associated to the EIM. It needs to be associated to an EIM before the EIM can send any profile state management operations. But this association is done in a simple way. The EIM configuration data needs to be sent simply to the EUICC. It can be sent either by the EIM or by the background system. And once this data is sent to the EUICC and the EIM is associated. Let's take a look at two scenarios how the EIM UICC association can be changed. There are also other scenarios possible. So there is a big flexibility with the EIM UICC association, but these are just two examples. So the first example is how this is possible to add the new EIM UICC association. So within the IoT architecture, this is possible that more than one EIM is associated with the UICC. In this picture, the EIM1 is already associated. To associate a new EIM, the configuration data of the new EIM has to be sent to the EUICC by the already associated EIM. As you can see in the animation, the EIM config data is first sent to the EIM1, and then the EIM config 2 data sent to the EUICC. What is very important is that there is no technical integration needed between the two EIMs. And let's see another example for the EIM UICC association. The EIM UICC association change without involving former EIM. So how the UICC EIM association can be changed without involving the former EIM. So it is possible to delete existing EIM UICC association in case the device implements a so-called reset functionality. So with this reset functionality, the EIM UICC associations or association can be deleted, and then the new EIM UICC association can be simply created, same way as we created the first one, sending the EIM2 configuration to the EUICC either from the EIM2 or from the backend system. So what we can see is the EIM UICC association is easier to be changed compared to the SMSR change in M2M. And again, there is no integration required between the two EIMs. So let's draw some conclusion from the EIM capabilities. There is a full business flexibility regarding the EIM. What does that mean? There can be multiple EIMs. EIM can be changed without the hurdles of the SMSR change in the M2M specification. The EIM is more independent from the SMDP Plus and the connectivity. And all of this allows to easily switch also the connectivity provider or to have a multi-vendor connectivity strategy. It allows also to use the IoT specification in consumer use cases where the connectivity, the MNO contract, is provided per device by the consumer user. So these were the conclusions from the EIM capabilities. And this is the technical introduction of the IoT specification. So now we would like to talk a little bit about the adoption of the specification and also a little bit what do we expect in short, mid, or long term. But before we are sharing our opinion about this, we would like to invite you for another poll. And this poll is about what do you think how the RSP specifications will evolve. I shared with you this second poll. There are 4 possible answers. You can select again multiple answers. Please read them and send us your opinion. Okay, so thank you for the answers. I'm closing now the poll. And share the results and also give it to Markus to a little bit analyze the results and also share our view on this.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Andras. I think the results are interesting and are mainly in line with my personal thinking. So when it is about the M2M spec, the majority is saying that the M spec will have probably hard times in the future and that the IoT spec will become dominant. And on the consumer side, you're saying that consumer IoT devices will mainly be based on the IoT spec. Yeah, let's see. I will come to this on the next couple of slides. So let's go back to slides. Yeah, thank you. Just to re-emphasize 2 things. First of all, we received the first question, so please just continue to type in questions in the tool. We will go through all the questions at the end. And second point, just wanted to re-emphasize the importance of this ERM component, which Andras explained, and the way it is architecturally integrated in the overall architecture. So this, in contrast to the former SMSR component, that makes a difference in terms of getting rid of all the business shortcomings of the M2M specification. Now, this allows to switch between connectivity providers, for example, because it's independent from the remote SIM provisioning architecture. And in particular, you can switch the ERM from one provider to another provider in a much more easier way. Yeah? You just need to configure the new data of a new ERM from a new vendor, if you want, in the old ERM and ask the ERM to push this to your device. The difference here is that there is no technical integration required between your current SMSR and a new SMSR. Technically, this integration is defined. It's part of the standard. It's part of the specification. But business-wise, this turned out always to be an obstacle because it means that 2 companies, which are even competitors, need to do a technical integration with each other. And because this is about 2 companies and the customer of these 2 companies who triggers the change is the third company, means between these 3 companies, you need to cover this all by contracts, by legal contracts. And in particular, this is where it becomes difficult. It's about agreeing who does what, who is paying for what, who is taking or covering which liabilities and all this. And this is where it becomes very complex. And very, very often, the conclusion is it's not feasible to do this change from a practical perspective because the effort to do the integration and the effort to set up a contract is so big that this is really an inhibitor. So let's look at how the new specification relates to the consumer spec and the M2M spec. The details have been explained by Andras, so I think it should be obvious. My first point is the IoT spec is not an evolution of the machine-to-machine specification. The architectures are very different, yeah, because this is the thinking of many people. Because the use cases might be related, and there is a thinking. Okay, there's the M2M spec today, and the IoT spec is something like the next release of the M2M spec. So this is not the case. It's very different. Means also there will not be something like a migration path from M2M to IoT. So means if you have set up a use case, deployed a use case based on M2M, and then the IoT spec is coming, and you want to evolve this step by step into the IoT specification, that will not be possible. In contrast to this, the IoT spec is very similar to the consumer spec. And let's say very simplistically speaking, the IoT spec is the consumer spec plus support for narrowband networks, but in a way which does not require a change of the core elements of the consumer spec, which is the SMDP+. So very smart approach. plus a kind of a remote LPA client, which is the ERM. So the LPA in the consumer spec was a software component on the device, which then was also used by the consumer interactively to trigger the download of a profile, to do all the profile lifecycle management operations and all this. So of course, in an IoT device, which may not have a user interface at all, this is not possible to do this on the IoT device. This is why the split of the former LPA into something which still resides on the device and something which is remote, which is the ERM, was happening. So again, this is then anticipating the needs from this use case environment. Right. So what do I expect, how the specification and the usage of the specification will evolve? Maybe first of all, I should say, this is of course my opinion. There's nothing set in stone. It's a little bit of black magic what will happen, of course, but we are following this evolution since many years now. We are talking to many companies, and I think we have quite a good idea. So previously, when the IoT spec was not available, of course, there still have been, or there already have been consumer IoT devices, and they have been partially covered by the consumer specification as far as possible. But if you want to cover an IoT device without a user interface, or a consumer IoT device without a user interface, or also consumer IoT devices which have only narrowband connectivity, that was not possible. The M2M spec was not feasible for any kind of consumer use case, because in the M2M spec, the technology results in the fact that not the consumer, not the user of the device brings the contract to the operator, the data tariff to the table, and can configure its own data tariff. That's not possible in the M2M spec. There needs to be one party who purchases for all the devices the connectivity, and this is deployed to the devices. In the consumer spec, this is not an option, or in the consumer space, this is not an option. But also in the new IoT spec, this is an option. Yeah? The ERM can trigger downloads of profiles related to communication services from various different operators. It's not a must, but it's an option. It means you can use the specification for consumer use cases, for the business model where the consumer gets the contract with the operator. But of course, you can also use the IoT spec for enterprise and industrial use cases, where the connectivity is purchased by the enterprise. And you can purchase the whole connectivity from one provider, but also the spec allows you to have a multi-vendor strategy and to switch vendors. So it gives you all the business flexibility. And that's why I think personally IoT spec will substitute the M2M spec over time more and more. The M2M spec will not go away immediately. And the reason is simply because there are already deployments and because there is no migration path to the IoT spec. So it means whatever has started based on the M2M spec, it will survive until end of life. And of course, there are still also products out there. And on the other hand, not yet the IoT products. So even in the near future, we will see even new deployments using the M2M spec. But IoT spec, from my perspective, will definitely become very successful. It will cover the consumer IoT devices as well as the majority of M2M and industrial use cases over time. And this is also what we hear from many industry players. There are really many companies desperately waiting on this IoT specification as it solves a problem, which are sometimes even really showstoppers to make use of IoT connectivity. Good. Yeah, next point, exactly. There's one obvious question which I'm hearing from time to time, because of the similarity of the IoT spec and the consumer spec, is could the consumer spec and the IoT spec converge in the future? Or also, why was it not designed right from the start as a single specification? Personally, I think this is a philosophical debate. Whether you have something in one document or two documents doesn't make a practical difference. The fact is, and the important thing is, the IoT spec utilizes many components and many interfaces of the consumer spec. And the IoT specification in this area, the standard document, will not list and specify all these interfaces and components once again. It will just reference the consumer specification. And because of this reference, it means that these specifications will also not evolve in different ways in the future for these components which are common to both specifications. Yeah. So whether it's one document or two documents, for me, a philosophical debate doesn't make really a difference. If you go to the next slide, Andras. Thanks a lot. So when we see products and how is the roadmap, or how do we see the roadmap towards adoption? So as said, M2M spec will not disappear immediately because of the existing deployments, because of lack of migration path, and because of no immediate availability of products, but the availability of IoT products will be very, very soon. So go to the next bullet, please, Andras. Right. And this will happen so soon, and the IoT spec is so attractive that many people, in particular the vendors of remote SIM provisioning components, but also then the enterprise users of this, think about, okay, should I still use the M2M spec or wait for the IoT spec? Or on the vendor side in particular, many have not yet upgraded the product portfolio to the latest version of the specification to 4.x, but are still on 3.x. And what we see in the industry is really that quite a number of companies really hesitate to do the investment to upgrade from 3 to 4.x because of simply the fact that the business volume will relate to 4.x when the IoT spec is available and the devices and the services are available. That is highly questionable. So we think that quite a number of companies will stay at the 3.x level for M2M and then immediately extend the offering by supporting the IoT spec, but not go to the 4.x specification anymore. Yeah. Right. So how will the IoT spec materialize in terms of products in the market? I think the first remark is that what has been published by the GSMA is the so-called Requirements and Architecture specification. So that is enough to have this discussion, which we have today, but it's not everything. There are additional documents which are elaborated and will be published soon. The first one is the so-called SGP 32. This is the detailed technical specification of all the components and the interfaces, and that is expected by end of the year. And there's typically also a dedicated test specification. This is a little bit a question mark because there is no roadmap yet, and working on test specification is always a difficult beast, or getting people and resources to work on test specification is always difficult because testing is seen as something which many people do not like. Of course, everybody likes does their own testing in order to ensure the quality of the product, but having a standardized test specification, which is then also used for conformance testing, for example, it's something where people lack the passion often to contribute to this. And also the question is always, yes, we have spent a lot of effort into official conformance testing in the past, but how will this evolve in the future? Will this have the same level of importance as it has had in the past? And that is questionable. So this is a little bit unclear. And last but not least, there will be specification not coming from the GSMA, but from the TCA, the industry organization, looking at the profiles. As Anders explained, there will also be the specification of a kind of specific IoT minimum footprint profile for very small devices, low-cost devices, devices which are less powerful, have very high limitations on battery consumptions, for example. So that will come also later in this year still. But the important thing is to note that it's not a must that these IoT devices make use of this new IoT profile. You can still implement standard compliant devices which use EU ICCs and eSIM profiles from the former world as they look like in the consumer and M2M world. So fully fledged profiles means also this is not something which slows down the process of having compliant products in the market and embracing this new IoT spec also on the enterprise side. This is just an add-on. How will it start? It will start what we see with pre-standard solutions, because the requirement or the request for products based on the IT specification is so big that companies, or at least some of them, will not wait until the standard is finally defined, so all this SGP 32, 33 specification, and then build products. But they will deliver already pre-standard products, and this is also easy in that case because of the many similarities to the consumer specification. So the SMDP Plus service is the same as in the consumer spec. It's already available. Technology is available, but also the managed services, the deployments are available. EU ICC and profiles, as said, you don't need to wait for this low footprint profile. You can start with what is there already. The IPA is a new component, but it's a kind of, it's derived from the LPA component of consumer devices. Means we know the technology is available at least on consumer devices, and from there you can learn how to do this on IoT devices. Yes, we will see more effort going into this because of the higher fragmentation of the IoT devices. Yeah, in the consumer space, it's easy. You have iOS and Android as the dominant operating systems, and you have LPA components from iOS and from Android, so more or less done. On the IoT side, it's a little bit more fragmented, and more development effort will be necessary to address the different kinds of devices. But on the other hand, that is also an option for differentiation and for additional features from the vendors there. So it's not a bad thing, and I think we know enough that this can be implemented also quite rapidly. The ERM is a standalone component, and not just architecturally, but also what we assume is that new vendors will show up to deliver the ERM component, not necessarily coming from the remote SIM provisioning space, so from the vendors who are providing SMDP Plus, SMDP services, but we will see vendors coming from the device management area, from the IoT platform services area, which provide ERM services. So you will have a richer choice in the future. You for sure will be able to get it from the RSP vendors, but you will also be able to get this from other vendors. And what we are hearing is that other vendors have already started to look into the shelf and just pick a remote device management component and then tweak this to become an ERM. The detailed specs of the interfaces are not yet defined, but you can do already something which is pre-standard, and this is happening. So we expect to see first offering very, very soon, maybe already available if you talk to the vendors, based on the existing standard as much as can be implemented today, as much as you can anticipate before the spec has been defined. And of course, not everything will turn out to be compliant to the final standard, but it will allow to do deployments much sooner, as it would be possible if you wait for the full specification. And that's what we expect. Yeah, and the vendor landscape, as I said, will become more rich between the RSP vendors and the ERM vendors, but it also allows you to have a split between the remote SIM provisioning provider, the SMDP Plus provider in that case, and the connectivity provider. So this can come from different vendors, whereas in the past, in the M2M environment, mostly the vendor you purchased the connectivity from also provided you with the SMDP and SMSR service. There is no need for this anymore. It's much easier to have a multi-vendor strategy, and it will be up to the enterprises and their vendor strategy, their purchasing strategy to decide and to define what they want. Okay, that's what we expect. So let's go through your questions. So we are coming towards the end of the session, and we see a number of questions in the tool. And Anders and myself, we will pick up the question and provide the answers as good as we can. So let's start with the first one. So we thought SMSR locking is also well documented in GSMA 4.2 standard. What are the main problems? So my understanding of the question is that this is the question saying, look, technically everything is defined also for the SMSR and the SMSR switch, but what is the problem? The problem is, as I said, on the business side, the legal side. Doing a technical integration with two competitors, which can cause friction, getting a legal contract set up between three parties, which is difficult, time-consuming, costly. So this is the real problem. The next question is, in the third generation GSMA RSP specification, still a consumer and an M2M architecture? So we have, and there's no evidence that this will change. We have three specification, and it will stay with three specification. The consumer spec will address consumer devices. The M2M spec is there in its version 4. As said, it's questionable how much effort will go into the evolution of this one. And we have the new IoT spec, which, as said, it's a philosophical debate whether this converges with consumer spec or not. I think it will stay separate. So we will have three specifications, and also the version 3 of the consumer spec, which has been published also only recently, does not make a change there at all. Difficult to give the answer. The architecture is the wish. The implementation spec will be the reality and the compromises. Do you really think the M2M product will disappear in long term? If yes, why? Thanks a lot. There may always be a niche of the M2M spec, and there might be players which don't have any issues with the business challenges. And there are already quite significant deployments out in the market based on M2M. So means whether it will go away totally or at least stay for a very long time as a niche, I think both can happen. But personally, I think really the IoT spec will become dominant. Yes, you're right, the details are in the technical spec. Let's see what, or if we see any surprises there. Of course, that will be of interest, and we will look at this with a lot of interest. I don't expect this, but you never know. So far, based on what we see, that's our assumption. Yeah. How is the backwards compatibility with the 4.2 spec? Do we need to update devices? As said, there is no question of compatibility. The IoT spec is break between towards the M2M spec. There's no compatibility. It's a different spec. There is no migration path from M2M to the IoT spec. So if you have a deployment based on M2M, then you need to stick to M2M. And a new deployment can be based on IoT. And if you want to use IoT, you need to do this separated from your M2M deployment, or you need to deploy new devices, new services for what has formerly been covered by the M2M spec. There's no interoperability, no compatibility, no backwards compatibility, and no migration path as we see this. When you think this architecture will be widely adopted and implemented, of course, the question is, what is widely? I'm pretty sure still during this year you will see deployments. As said, very few, probably based on pre-standard products, more towards the end of the year, even if the spec, the technical spec, is not yet published, but there will be working versions available, which will allow companies to evolve their pre-standard products to something which will be very close to the final specs. And widely adopted, I would expect this happening in next year then, which is pretty fast for new specification, by the way. What is the next one? 1 second. Here we go. Which type of companies do you see operating the ERM component in the ecosystem? As said, it will be still the question is twofold: who will operate and who will provide the ERM component. The vendors of the ERM component will be the classical SMDP Plus vendors or SMDP vendors formerly, but as said, also companies coming from device management and from IoT platform areas. Operating of these services, this can be done by the enterprise the customer of the component and the user of the use case himself. It can be provided by all the vendors, and also it can be provided by the operators as a managed service in combination with the connectivity offering to the customers. Can you confirm that the ERM does not need to be GSMA SM certified? That's a good question. We had the same yesterday. And the answer is no, we cannot. At the moment, we don't know this. I think that will be an interesting one along the discussions in the next couple of weeks and months in the GSMA. But there's one remark which I wanted to make is, since last year, there are at least GSMA SaaS compliant and certified hosting environments, cloud hosting offerings available from all the big cloud providers, Microsoft, Google, and Amazon. So it means the hurdle to deliver a GSMA SaaS compliant ERM managed service is much lower than it was before, when each and every provider needed to certify their own data center and their own service and all this, which was quite expensive and took quite a big effort. So this is becoming much easier now. Whether the SaaS compliance is required at all, that's a good question. We don't know yet. Do you think that IoT eSIM growth could be driven by private network needs? So, i.e., no need for SMS, simpler architecture. Do you expect for live deployments once standard is approved? So, what we know, of course, is that many or a number of IoT use cases, when you look at the connectivity, are not necessarily based on the public networks, but to some extent also based on private networks. For many, many reasons, security, quality of service, things like this. And this will also happen with the IoT specification. Of course, if you do this in a private network, you always have the chance to deviate from the standards, because interoperability and standard compliance then is not that relevant anymore. This is maybe where in private networks also this pre-standard IoT devices could show up first. Because of lack of need of full standard compliance. Will we see this? I'm not sure. I don't think so, honestly. I'm skeptical, at least on the broad scale, because the technology is well known. The consumer technology is already available, which is a big part of the IoT spec. So why doing something differently? So there might be use cases with very specific requirements which are not covered by the standards, and then you will deviate and do this as a custom project on a private network potentially. But I think most use cases can be covered by the standard compliant products and services, and then this will happen. This is my expectation. Do you expect for live deployments, once it is approved, separate dedicated SMDP Plus for eSIM IoT traffic, i.e. no reuse of current SMDP processing for the consumer eSIM transactions, or a single SMDP Plus platform processing consumer eSIM transactions and IoT eSIM transactions? I think we need to differentiate between the vendor side and probably the operators. On the vendor side, so the typical vendors of SMDP Plus and former also SMDP services, they will deliver this out of one platform. Of course, they have the ability in the products to do multi-tenant deployments, to do separate deployments for separate customers. And this is irrespective of whether it's used for IoT and consumer, or whether this is simply sold to two different operators who want both to use an SMDP Plus service, so this kind of separation. But the platform as such will be a single platform because of efficiency and because there's simply no need for anything else. If you look at the operators, and the operators typically purchase these SMDP Plus services to combine it with their connectivity offerings, there's not necessarily a technical questions to purchase two different SMDP Plus service for the two use cases, but typically it's the question or the trigger comes from the organization, the governance, financial aspects, budget aspects, and things like this. So there's typically a consumer branch in an operator, they have their own budgets, they have their own vendors, they purchase on their own. And there is very often an enterprise division of the same operator with an own budget, own vendor relationships, own contracts, and so forth. So I would expect that operators purchase the SMDP Plus service twice, or many of them, as I said, not because of technical reasons, but only because of budget, governance, process reasons, and so forth. Yeah. How long do you think M2M RSP services disappear? How devices stay in the field for 15, 20 years? Yeah, that's right. M2M or enterprise use cases have quite often a very long time to live. Yeah, well, that's 15 or 20 years, but it's more than in the consumer space. In the consumer space, after 3 years, the device is old-fashioned. This is not the case in the IoT space, and this is why also in 5 or 10 years we will see M2M services, because the deployments are not yet end of life. So it will the M2M spec will stay for quite long, even if it's just to cover the existing deployments from the past. STP32 is a spec for the implementation. Impressive roadmap from GSMA if you compare to STP22 phase 3, almost 3 years. Yes, that's right. There's no technical reason for this. I think this is the dynamics between the companies involved in the working groups and contributing to the working groups. Whereas on the consumer side, the phase 3, that was, or the situation is there that the specifications for consumer are already pretty mature. So most features which are essential have already been part of 2.3 and 2.4. And on the other hand, a number of quite important features have already been implemented by various players in a proprietary and bespoke way. So what was left for phase 3? Maybe not a lot. My expectation is that it will take quite some time until we see phase 3 consumer products in the market. And on the other hand, on the IoT side, there was and still is really a real desperate need for a new specification because of these issues of M2M. The issue was so significant and so relevant that maybe it was easier for people to find compromises and to agree on something because of the big need from the market. Yeah, market need and customer need is always a good driver, also to find compromises. And also the fact was that it was a little bit not yet dominated by companies who have already deployed something and who wanted to ingest this into the new specification. So it was really a little bit more starting from scratch, and that's why it was easier than with version 3. So there are reasons why there are different speeds for the consumer new spec and this IoT new spec. Yeah. Just to give you some insights from our perception, being also part of the working groups. Is there any commercial integration that is needed for ERM switch? The answer is no, but there's a but, and the but is important, and I need to highlight this. So there's no integration. You need to configure the data of the new ERM in your old ERM, and then push the button to upload this to your devices. There's no technical integration, in particular, not anything what requires a contractual coverage or so necessary. So this is what makes things easy. But the very important and a little bit strange point is the feature that an ERM supports to upload data of another ERM into the devices is only an optional feature in the specification. It's not a mandatory feature in the specs. So if you are not carefully selecting your products, you may end up in an ERM which doesn't support the feature because it's not mandatory. So my recommendation is, because of the importance of this feature, and because maybe even if it's not important today, but it might be important in the future, if you select your vendors, if you run your RFPs, I would make sure that the ERM I would purchase really comes with this feature, and that this is a guaranteed feature of what I'm purchasing. So that's the important caveat here on this. and honestly no idea why this is not a mandatory feature. Can you please explain more the so-called lightweight protocol? Is it OTA SMS based? Andras, I think you have a better idea of what protocols could cover this narrow band requirement.
Yeah, this is not the SMS based, so SMS is not in scope really of the IoT. What is in scope is the typical IoT protocols, QoP, lightweight M2M. So these kind of protocols which are in scope. Yeah.
Right. Before I continue to answer questions, there are still a handful of more questions because we are coming to the end of the official end of the seminar from a timing perspective. So it's 10 o'clock here in Germany now. So some of you may need to leave because of you have a hard stop and other calls or appointment now. So we will continue for another couple of minutes to answer the remaining questions. But for those who need to leave, I would already now like to thank you for your participation, to thank you for the huge number of questions, which also tells us that you agree that this is a very relevant topic. Please, if you want, stay in contact with us on the topic. Maybe you have more questions in this area. We would love to hear from you. You can find us on LinkedIn. You will find our email addresses in the slides. So happy to stay in contact with you. So thanks a lot for this. And for all those which still have a couple of minutes, we will continue for another couple of minutes. So could a device management platform evolve to offer also ERM functions? I think the answer is yes, and we think that this is going to happen. Yeah, there are already many vendors who provide device management capabilities for IoT devices, for machine-to-machine devices, and for them it's quite natural to add this ERM capability to their products. So that will happen for sure. Do you see any proprietary feature from the big three, Thales, IDEMIA, G&D, which may impact how old standard merge with new standard? So it's always difficult to comment on proprietary features because the question is what is proprietary and what insights we have or you have. I would not like to comment on this. I would like to just keep it at the general level. We think that the M2M standard is one standard, the IoT standard is another standard. There is no roadmap from the one to the other. So we all, including the big three or any other company, I think we start with this new standard and products in relationship to this new standard separate to the M2M standard in terms of the offering, in terms of deployments. And maybe this is why the question regarding proprietary features on the M2M side maybe is also less relevant. Yeah. Can you share any insight on ongoing development on new devices models that will support the new spec? When do you expect IoT spec compatible devices being available for enterprises? As I said, we expect pre-standard devices in 2022, still this year, even though the publishing of the SUP22, the technical spec, is only expected for end of the year. Yeah, but the architecture spec tells you already quite a number of things. The technical spec, even though published end of the year, it's work in progress, and over time they will already fix, at least tentatively, certain aspects which will allow to build devices which are more and more standard compliant. Of course, from a formal perspective, devices can only be standard compliant when the standard exists. Means this will not be in 2022, but only in 2023, in the next year. That's the official answer. Yeah, but I said close to standard devices, I would assume towards the end of the year. But I think talk to your vendors, and that's the best thing you can do. Yeah, because before something is officially launched, it's better to talk to your vendors and just ask them. So if you have pressure and you want to do a new deployment of a use case, and so say, look, I have pressure, I don't want to use the M2M spec anymore on the one hand side. On the other hand, I don't want to next year. So if you're in this kind of situation, I would propose talk to a vendor and ask them to get a kind of preview of the roadmaps, which tells you a little bit better what is available today, what is available in 3 and 6 months, and how will this look like. And then you can base your decision based on these insights. Does the SIM-OS changes from this IoT ecosystem?
So there are two things which are important here. Is that the UICC needs to support the lightweight profile. So this is in the profile interpreter. It's some changes needed, and also the configuration operation. So the EIM UICC association, these operations. So these needs to be supported by the SIM, and it would require some changes in the OS.
Right, but these are just extensions or changes, but there is no need for a fundamental or very different new SIM-OS, right?
No.
Does LPAE have a role to play with this ecosystem, or rather, does LPAE have any need in the industry now? Maybe also Andras, maybe you're better positioned than I to answer this.
For the LPAE, I myself has not really seen LPAEs. This is a topic, so it will be part of the specification. But how? Yeah, so probably with the integrated SIM, it would be more in focus. But I can't tell here any concrete things.
Does this IoT ecosystem always meet the enterprise requirements of long-awaited phase 3? So phase 3 is related to the consumer spec. Not sure. Phase 3 comes with certain features, new features, which are also related to enterprise use cases, but less enterprise IoT use cases, but enterprise use cases for personal devices, for phones, for pets, for laptops. Not sure if you mean this. So part of the phase 3 spec is, for example, a feature which allows enterprises or managed service providers acting on behalf of enterprises, for example, to do profile lifecycle management operations and other management operations, not just for an individual device. This is how it was for the consumer spec, but also for groups of devices. Which are defined by the enterprise. So it could be the company phones of the whole enterprise, could be the company phones of a certain department of the enterprise or so. So it means there are bulk operations possible, bulk profile lifecycle management operations possible for enterprises, but still for personal devices, not for the IoT devices. The EIM, of course, can implement also bulk operations. This is not limited. Nobody says that the EIM is restricted to operations per device. That's also possible. So I'm not 100% sure if this answers your question, actually, but this is what comes to my mind when seeing your question.
Yeah,
when you see the first commercial IoT eSIM product to come to market, I think we discussed this during the year. Maybe pretty soon, but it depends on, it will be based on pre-standard product. And of course, the question is, what does sense for a company, an enterprise who wants to make use of this? To what extent is pre-standard okay for you? Or to what extent do these pre-standard products need to be at least very close to the final ones? That's your decision. But product in 2022 for sure. Do you think that operators, SMDP Plus service providers could support both consumer and IoT device on the same SMDP Plus? Yeah, I think we answered this. On the provider side of SMDP Plus, yes, same platform. Those companies who purchase both, for example, operators, for a number of non-technical reasons, I would expect that these companies, in particular operators, will purchase such a service twice. Okay, but then Anders, I think I've answered all the questions, right?
Yep. Yes.
Perfect. Then thanks for your patience. It took 11 minutes longer than scheduled, but I think it was worth going through all your questions. And once again, thanks a lot for all the questions, which tells us that this is of relevance for you. And it's, of course, definitely also of relevance for us because we have similar decisions to take than you have, because it's also about how can we evolve our product portfolio to cover also the IoT specification. And this is what we are working on. This is definitely going to happen. And as I said, we have similar decisions to take than you have. But also on our side, we have the ambition to be very fast because we recognize the desperate need in the industry for this specification. That's also why we want to evolve our products as soon as possible to cover all these new specifications. So for today, I'd like to thank you. Stay in contact with us on LinkedIn, on our company website. And as I said, more than happy to also continue discussion in other ways. For today, thanks for your attention, thanks for the question, and goodbye from my side, and have a good day.
Goodbye.